This is a Pulp archive recording. All public Pulp archive recordings are licensed under Creative Commons. For more information or to support us, please visit patreon.com/pulparchive. This episode was prepared by Saul and narrated by Tucker, the digital narrator. Girl. A Glass Hunches by Reginald C Barker. West July 1926. This episode contains period-typical depictions of crime, violence, and mild profanity. Listener discretion is advised. When Jack Taylor heeded his insistent hunch and went down out of the hills, his partner, Bill Faraday, was moved to great anger over the desertion. But while the mighty hydraulic giant tore gold from the earth day by day, the hunch came to prove itself true in a manner beyond Bill's knowing. In the upper waters of Moore's Creek, a tributary of the Boise River, Idaho, placer mining for gold was in full swing. With yellow, muddy water swirling around his rubber-booted knees, little Jack Taylor worked beneath the blazing June sun, forking the larger boulders out of the race down which the gold-bearing gravel was rushing toward the string of sluice boxes at the lower end of the claim. Above his head, a silver crescent of water rose and fell, gleaming with a million prismatic colors. As from his post at the hydraulic giant, Taylor's partner, Bill Faraday, elevated or depressed the nozzle of the gun. One could not have heard himself speak as the powerful stream of water roared and pounded at the base of a 20-foot bank from which a huge mass of gravel occasionally would slip into the race, with a sodden splash as the giant undermined the bar. A big black horsefly, buzzing unconcernedly through the fine, many-colored spray that hung in the air above Taylor, settled soundlessly and drove its bill into the back of his sunburned neck. With a wholehearted malediction, the placer miner raised a hand and made a swipe at the scourge, knocking it into the water to be whirled away. Over at the giant, Bill Faraday grinned. Then, after glancing at the sun to make sure that high noon was at hand, waved a hand to his partner. Thankfully, Taylor climbed onto the bedrock and, hurrying up to the penstock on the hill, shut off the water. The roar ceased and the giant stood idle with a little stream still trickling from its brazen mouth. "How's she coming?" asked Faraday as Taylor joined him, and together they started back to their cabin and dinner. "All right, Bill." The tone of the younger man's voice was sullen, almost defiant. "But I've got a hunch that I'd oughter go home." "Huh?" There was surprise and dismay in the tone of Faraday as he stopped and looked down at his partner. "You are crazy, man, plumb nuts. How in the name of a nugget can you go home now, when it's all the two of us can do to handle the work on the claim?" Taylor rolled down the tops of his hip boots. Then he straightened up his insignificant height of 5'2" and stood wistfully gazing at the distant summit of the divide beyond which lay his little ranch in the Boise Valley. "I know that I ought not to leave just now, Bill," he acknowledged, "but my hunch tells me to go home, and I am going." Faraday did not reply, but softly whistling between his teeth, entered the cabin. The slam of the stove covers as he started a fire showed plainly what he was thinking. Fraught with significance, silence fell between the partners as they seated themselves at the little hewn table and heaped their plates with beans. Taylor was the first to speak. "Didn't you ever have a hunch, Bill?" "I did," was the short answer. "I had a hunch that I was a condemned fool to stay partners with you after you went and got married, and my hunch came true." He speared at a bean with his fork so viciously that the tines only grazed it, and it leaped from his plate and tried to fly out of the window. "Married men," sneered Faraday, "are no more like us old bachelors than that bean is like a hummingbird." "You are a good partner, Bill," said the little man placatingly, "and you are a first-class placer miner, but there is a lot of things you don't know about being married." "There's a darn sight more things that you don't know about mining," retorted the big miner. "Or you wouldn't think about leaving me to work the claim alone." "My hunch says go home," explained Taylor. "Just what is wrong, I don't know, but maybe the turkeys have got the mumps," suggested Faraday sarcastically. "But I am going to see," concluded Taylor. "I'll be back in a week or 10 days if all is well." Faraday swung his long booted legs over his bench and unfolded his 6 feet of height. "You can go plumb to Ashtabula, Ohio for all I care," he snarled. But you don't need to come back. You and I are through." "Do you mean that, Bill?" "Better think twice about that," said Taylor quietly. "Once is a plenty," retorted Faraday. "We may as well weigh out the gold, so as you can take your share along the share of the claim and the machinery you can have valued. I'll pay you for them later." Taylor loved the gold scale, which had been his constant companion for many years. From Nome to Canania, it had accompanied him in his wanderings, weighing to the last grain the little piles of precious metal, which occasionally he panned out. Now from the shelf above the double bunk he took and opened the warm mahogany case and set up the delicate instrument which had cost him $90. As he watched the vibration of the balances, his blue eyes saddened, for it crossed his mind that he was about to weigh his hunch against his love for Bill Faraday. "What's the use of getting mad over a little thing like a hunch, Bill?" he said pleadingly. "I'll be back as soon as I can." "I ain't mad," asserted Faraday. "But if you can play your hunch, I can do the same, and my hunch tells me I'll do better alone." With a sigh, Taylor took a buckskin sack of gold dust from beneath the mattress of the double bunk, and first untying a thong around its neck, tipped a stream of golden grains into the pans of the scales until they balanced evenly. "Well?" he said as he poured his own share back into the sack and watched his partner drop his into a tobacco can. "Someday I'll be back. If you still feel the same way, we'll settle up then for good. So long, Bill." Faraday did not answer as he tossed his can of gold dust carelessly on the bunk. Then, without taking any notice of his partner's outstretched hand, he strode out of the cabin, and soon Taylor heard the hydraulic giant once more angrily roaring. At sunset, Faraday shut off the water. Then he stood for a few moments, thoughtfully eyeing the gravel bank upon which all that afternoon he had been playing a steady stream from the giant. Undermined by the stream from the nozzle, a huge mass of red earth and water-washed boulders hung ominously above the slowly emptying race. "Hunch!" greeted Faraday aloud. "My hunch tells me that I'd better get some of those boulders out of the race before that muck drops." With an 18 sluice fork in his hand, he stepped into the water and began furiously to lift out the larger of the stones. Slowly, the light faded from lavender to purple and from purple to gray, but still, with the perspiration dropping from his forehead and soaking through his thin blue cotton shirt in dark patches, Bill Faraday worked on, so engrossed in what he was doing that entirely he failed to notice that no longer was he alone. "Say, partner." Faraday turned quickly as the harsh voice cut into the evening silence. Standing on the edge of the race was a powerfully built man with wandering black eyes set close together beneath a backward-sloping forehead. With the knotted fingers of one hand, the stranger tugged at one corner of a heavy red mustache as he glanced here, there, and everywhere except at Faraday. "What do you want?" There was a certain ugliness in Faraday's tone, for all the afternoon he had been brooding over the fact that his partner had left him to work the claim alone. "Name Bascom," grunted the new arrival. "Came up from the valley to hunt a job. Met a little guy who claimed to be your partner and said you were short a hand. I got a hunch I've seen him before someplace, but can't just place him." "What's the matter with putting me to work? Miner?" asked Faraday with an appraising glance at Bascom's barrel chest and wide shoulders, from which hung arms thick and long like those of a gorilla. "Miner is right," growled Bascom, "or anything else that calls for the strength of two men. I'm a bear at moving boulders." "All right, partner," said Faraday, relieved at the thought of securing help he needed so badly. "You can try out your strength in the race tomorrow. Let's go and eat." When they entered the cabin, Faraday saw with surprise that the gold scale still stood where they had left it. Carefully, he dismounted it and laid it away in its mahogany case. Bascom watched him with narrowed eyes. "Looks like you might have had a cleanup," he intimated. "How's she paying, Faraday, with a stranger present? You better go after a bucket of water while I am starting the fire." So, grunted Faraday shortly, for he was of no mind to discuss his affairs. Bascom had only worked a few hours the next day before it became perfectly evident to Faraday that the man had not boasted or exaggerated when stating that he possessed the strength of two men. Knee-deep in the swirling yellow race, he lifted out boulders which weighed all of 200 pounds, with the ease of a child removing a toy boat from a puddle of rainwater. A surly, non-communicative brute of a man, Asa Bascom was, carrying a blackened corncob pipe upside down between his big teeth. He wrestled with the boulders on Faraday's claim. Faraday had never met a man like Bascom, and the more he studied his employee, the more puzzled he became. For although he tried his best to draw the man out, Bascom either could not or would not talk. A giant physically, he appeared to possess only the mentality of a child, and like a child, he seemed interested only in simple things. "Ever in Nome?" asked Faraday one day while they were eating lunch. "Nome?" Bascom tugged at one corner of his huge mustache. "Yes," he acknowledged after much thought. "I've been to Nome." He fell to eating again, then added suddenly, "There is ice and snow at Nome." "There was some pretty rich ground there, too, wasn't there?" hinted Faraday. "Ground?" For a moment, Bascom's wandering eyes were still. He seemed to be trying to remember something, then he sighed and gave it up. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe?" "What were you doing there that you don't know something about the rich strikes that were made?" asked Faraday. "Me?" said Bascom. "I was chucker out at Caribou Carson's cafe when the boys got too rough. I used to take 'em by the necks 2 at a time and knock their heads together before chucking 'em out in the snow." Faraday himself was more than 6 feet and his weight was 190 pounds. But as day after day he covertly sized up Asa Bascom, he began to feel a fear of the man's immense strength. Should those gorilla-like arms ever close around Faraday, he knew that his ribs would crack like a soft-shelled walnut beneath the palms of a boy. It was not that Bascom had ever shown the least inclination to take advantage of his strength. Stolid of face and chary of speech, he reminded Faraday of a great ape. As with the huge muscles of his back and shoulders bulging his cotton shirt, impervious or indifferent to the heat and the attacking horseflies which buzzed around him, he hoisted the dripping boulders out of the swiftly flowing yellow race. Seldom did Bascom ask questions. Seldom did he evince any interest whatever in anything except his work. At night, while Faraday lay on the bunk reading one of the old magazines he and Taylor had brought with them to the hills, Bascom would sit all hunched over on a 3-legged stool, with his head between his great paws and his jaw moving, as reflectively he stared at a chromo above a calendar which hung on the cabin wall. There was nothing extraordinary in the colored print. It was just one of the usual things put out by a life insurance company in which Faraday held a policy. But it seemed to possess a strange fascination for Asa Bascom, who was the strong guy. Thus one night Bascom broke a silence which had endured since they had quit work for the day. "The strong guy?" repeated Faraday, as puzzled he looked up from his book. Then as he followed the direction of Bascom's pointing finger, it suddenly came to him that the man could not read. "That," explained Faraday, indicating the chromo on the wall, "is a picture of Atlas supporting the world on his shoulders." Bascom chewed systematically for a full minute. Then he expectorated and inquired, "What did he do that for?" "As near as I can remember," replied Faraday, scratching his head, "Atlas tried to bust his way into heaven, but they got the best of him, and to hold him down piled the whole world on his shoulders." "Some strong guy, I'll tell the world," said Bascom. "Wonder it hadn't busted his back." The next day at noon, Faraday stayed in the cabin to throw out the last of the cooked beans, for during dinner he had thought them to be turning sour. Then he washed the kettle before setting on some more beans to cook. When he reached the claim, to his astonishment, Bascom was kneeling at the head of the sluice boxes with a gold pan in his great paws. Oblivious of Faraday's approach, he whirled the pan of gravel in his hands, until at last there was nothing left in it but a thin string of yellow grains. After an appraising glance, Bascom washed them out into the race and, laying the gold pan down where it was kept at the head of the boxes, turned to find himself facing Faraday. There was not much reason for Faraday to have suspected the man of nefarious designs upon the cleanup, had not Bascom possessed such superhuman strength and such diabolical features. In all probability, Faraday would not have given the matter a second thought. As it was, there was smoldering anger in his tone. "If there is any panning going to be done on this claim, Bascom, I'd rather do it myself." Bascom clenched his great hands until the knuckles stood out white against the tan. Then a gusty sigh broke from the huge chest of the miner, and picking up his sluice fork, he moved heavily away like a great dumb beast. "It's all right, boss," he said. "I ain't trying to bust into your heaven." "You can turn the water into the penstock," ordered Faraday, feeling strangely at odds with himself. He strode over to the giant, and soon a silver bow of water rose high into the air. Faraday depressed the nozzle of the gun until a powerful stream bit into the red gravel bar, and down the race into which Bascom had returned with his sluice fork rushed a steady stream of boulders and mud. Standing at the giant, Faraday watched the huge shoulders of the man in the race as he strained at the heavy water-washed boulders, some of them still sticky with gobs of the yellow mud in which they had been embedded. With his shirt sleeves rolled to his shoulders, Bascom was throwing out the smaller stones with the sluice fork. But when a swirl in the water advertised the presence of an exceptionally large rock, he would lay the sluice fork down on the edge of the race, and plunging his thick, hairy arms up to the shoulders in the swift current, grip the boulder with fingers strong as steel tongues. To the heaving of his immense shoulder and back muscles, the top of the rock would slowly emerge, slick and shiny as a rain-washed watermelon. Higher, higher, Bascom would raise the huge pebble, until at last bent beneath its weight like an old man of the sea, he would drop it on the bedrock with a great grunt of relief. Then, without a moment's pause, he would step back into the race and tackle the next one. "Powerful brute," ran Faraday's thoughts, and the best worker I ever saw. "But I've got a hunch that I'd better get rid of him before cleanup time." For if he ever seized the gold, suddenly he gasped and bent almost double, for agonizing as the thrust of a knife, pain shot across his middle. "It's those beans I ate at noon," he groaned aloud. "I thought they were beginning to sour." Then the pain gripped him again with such violence that involuntarily he swung the gun around until the stream struck Bascom and knocked him head over heels into the yellow waters of the race. With an animal-like grunt, Bascom picked himself up, wading ashore. He stood for a moment, wringing out the ends of his huge mustache and watching the liquid mud stream from his clothes. Then suddenly he raised his eyes and stared stupidly at a sparkling white tower of water hurtling skyward. Then at the hydraulic giant. Relieved of Faraday's guiding hand, the nozzle of the gun was pointing upward at an angle of nearly 60 degrees. "I got a hunch that something is busted," muttered Bascom, shuffling toward the machine. It had sprawled on the bedrock beside the giant. Bill Faraday was writhing in agony. "'Some matter?" asked Bascom. "Stomachache," with both hands pressed to his middle. Faraday tried to tie himself into a knot, the while muttering unintelligibly. Whereupon Bascom wasted no more of his precious words, but picking up his employer much as he would have handled a boulder, slung him across his shoulder and carried him into the cabin, where he deposited Faraday on the bunk. Taking a handful of salt from a sack, Bascom threw it into a cup, which he then filled with warm water. "Have one on me," he invited. The Faraday only groaned, for the pain was excruciating. Red-hot tongue seemed to be squeezing out his life without any show of hurry. Bascom extended a huge thumb and forefinger and took Faraday by the nose, at the same time pressing a knee into the struggling man's tortured stomach. Involuntarily, Faraday opened his mouth to gasp for air, whereupon Bascom unceremoniously poured a half-cupful of warm brine down his patient's throat, paying not the least attention to the wildly flailing arms that beat about his head. "It's all right," grunted Bascom as he stepped back. "I cured a poisoned pup that way once." Then, seating himself upon a stool, he chewed methodically and stared at the picture of Atlas supporting the earth upon his shoulders. "Some guy," muttered Bascom from time to time. "I'll tell the world." Weakened by the emetic, but out of pain, Faraday at last fell asleep from sheer exhaustion. Seeing which, Bascom arose to his feet and lumbered out of the cabin and across the claim to the giant, which still spouted a silver stream skyward. Just what fascination there is in directing a powerful stream of water into a gravel bank, it is hard to say. Yet the job of piper is coveted by every man who ever worked on a placer claim. Seldom indeed did Bascom enjoy the feel of the swinging gun beneath his great fingers, for wherever he had been employed as a placer miner, his immense strength had always caused the boss to put him to work in the race to wrestle with water-washed boulders. In his dumb way, Bascom always wanted to get a chance at running the giant. so that it was with a sense of satisfaction that he depressed the nozzle until, with a shattering roar, the silver stream was busy gouging out the base of the 20-foot gravel bar. Through the remainder of that hot afternoon, Bascom kept the stream from the nozzle playing to and fro across the base of the big red gravel bar. Now and again a boulder would drop with a splash into the race. More often than not, a chunk of surface stripping would slip noiselessly from the upper part of the bar, and Bascom would be compelled to turn the stream aside into the race while he cut away a mass of tangled roots. But by the time the heat of the day began to cool, the stream had undermined the gravel bar to a depth of 3 or possibly 4 feet. Projecting from the face of the gravel above this cave was a boulder which must have weighed nearly 700 pounds. Loosened by the steady pounding of the stream from the nozzle, it fell suddenly. For a moment, Bascom eyed it, then slowly he swung the nozzle aside and, lumbering up to the penstock on the hill above the claim, shut it down and turned the water out through the waste gate. "I got a hunch," he muttered, "that I can move that rock," rolling up the tops of his gum boots, which, for the sake of coolness, he had kept rolled below his knees. All that blazing afternoon he stepped into a mass of sticky gravel, upon which the huge boulder had fallen. It was an ugly wedge-shaped rock some 3 feet across. The thicker part of the boulder lay next to the race, so Bascom figured that by turning his back to the undermined gravel bar, he could get those powerful fingers of his beneath the thinner edge of the boulder and tip it over. It was not a hard lift for a man possessed of the strength of Asa Bascom, for owing to the position of the stone, 2/3 of its weight lay in that part of it furthest away from the man, a fact which in itself would aid him in his effort to tip it over. Slowly Bascom stooped until his searching fingers obtained a firm grip. Then, gradually exerting his strength, he began to heave. As he heaved, his gum-booted feet sank lower into the soft, wet gravel which had been washed from the bar behind him. A sucking noise came from under the slowly rising stone as rushing beneath it the air helped to force the mud in which the boulder lay to relinquish its sticky grip. Behind Bascom, little chunks of gravel began to fall from the undermined bar, but this he could not see as, with every muscle of his body strained to its utmost, he heaved and grunted in an effort to turn the boulder over. Inch by inch, his booted feet sank deeper into the slush, and inch by inch the top of the boulder began to rise, until at last it stood almost on its edge. Then, just as it tipped over from the face of the undermined gravel bar behind Bascom, a mass of wet, muddy red gravel slid soundlessly onto his shoulders and pinned him face downward across the boulder as it flopped into the almost empty race. Fortunately for Bascom, his head protruded over the edge of the rock. Otherwise, he would have been suffocated instantly. As it was, he was pinned down, helpless to move. His heart seemed to wilt, as behind him he heard the falling of little stones and gobs of mud from the face of the 20-foot gravel bar, advertising that it was about to cave again. In vain, Bascom tried to move his arms so that he might secure a purchase with his great hands and thus wriggle free. The best he could do was to wiggle his fingers about in the soft mud beneath them. Unless help came immediately, he was doomed, for behind him the entire face of the gravel bar was getting ready to break away. Realizing this, Bascom opened his mouth and let out a roar that was echoed back from canyon wall to canyon wall. Twice, 3 times he shouted for help, but so deep was Faraday's sleep of exhaustion he did not hear, and only the chookin of the startled squirrel answered the giant's frenzied calls for assistance. Just about the time Bascom had given up all hope, across the claim came trotting a little man with freshly shaven gills and a smile on his countenance which would have set fire to a snowball. "Hey!" hollered Jack Taylor. "Where are you, Bill? My hunch came true." Suddenly he stopped in amazement, and his mouth fell open, for he had caught sight of Bascom's big mustached face and popping eyes sticking out over the edge of the buried boulder. "Help!" yelled the pinned-down giant. "Bar's slipping." Taylor shot one glance at the buried man, then one at the gravel bar from which another boulder had just fallen. That was enough. With a single word of encouragement, he whirled and, racing up the hill to the ditch, shut down the waste gate and turned the water into the penstock. Then down the hill he came 10 feet to a jump. Seizing the gun, he whirled it around just as the water shot through the nozzle like a big round bar of silver steel. Into the mass of gravel which pinned Bascom down, Taylor drove the 400 miner's inches of water, compressed into a stream 6 inches in thickness. Smack! Gravel boulders and mud were lifted off Bascom's back, as though blown away by the breath of a cyclone, as Taylor played the nozzle of the gun to and fro, to and fro. Another instant, and Bascom would have been freed of the weight that pinned him down, but just then, behind him, slowly and deliberately, the entire face of the huge gravel bar began to tip forward. Bascom could not see this, but Taylor's face went white. Then suddenly he yelled, "Got to lift you out of there, old-timer. Look out, here she comes." And deliberately, Taylor swung the nozzle until the powerful stream of water struck Bascom where it would hurt him the least. Like a paper boat lifted by a wave, he felt himself propelled through space. Then down, down he fell onto the bedrock and into utter darkness. Silent and ugly in intent, 100 tons of red, wet earth slipped from the gravel bar and over the boulder upon which a moment before he had lain. When Bascom came to, he looked up into the face of the little man who had told him where to get a job. For a moment he stared with a puzzled expression on his homely features. Then slowly he crawled to his feet and put out a huge paw. "I had a hunch I'd seen you before, partner," he growled. "Remember me?" Taylor's eyes were blank for a full minute. Then suddenly he gripped the giant's hand. "Yeah," he admitted. "You are the fellow who kicked me out of Caribou Carson's cafe in Nome, Alaska, nearly 15 years ago. I told you then I'd get even with you sometime, remember?" Side by side, the little man and the giant strode over to the cabin on the bar. A bit shaky on his pins, but otherwise all right. Bill Faraday met them at the door. "Well," he exclaimed as he caught sight of his partner, "had a hunch to come back, did you?" "I came back after my gold scales and the settlement, if you still want it," grinned Taylor. "I left them here purposely so's you could weigh the cleanup." Faraday stepped aside to allow Taylor and Bascom to enter the cabin, soaked and muddy. Bascom sank down on a stool. Taking out a sopping plug of tobacco, he bit off a huge chunk, and rhythmically moving his jaws to and fro, stared resentfully at the picture of Atlas supporting the earth on his bowed shoulders. "It can't be done," muttered Bascom, wagging his great head to and fro. "I'll tell the world." "Well," grinned Faraday, turning to his little partner, "how did you find the wife?" "I'll bet everything was okay and that your hunch was all wrong. Never did believe in hunches myself. There is nothing to 'em." He did not mention the matter of settlement. "That's where you show your ignorance, partner," said little Jack Taylor quietly. "My hunch was right enough. It was a boy, and we named him Bill." Thank you so much for hanging out today. My name is Saul, and this is the Pulp Archive. Now, if you had fun, I'd appreciate it if you could like, subscribe, comment, and share. That stuff really helps. And like most stories we cover here, today's was recommended by you. So if there's a story you'd like to see, send us an email at pulparchivelibrary@gmail.com. We'd love to cover it. If you'd like to support the podcast and keep us going, consider becoming a member on Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/pulparchive. For a few bucks a month, you'll get access to all our podcasts, narration of complete issues, and private explicit episodes that wouldn't be allowed publicly. We feature almost every genre of pulp fiction, horror, detective, western, and even sports. Special thanks to our patrons who make the podcast possible and make every episode of the Pulp Archive happen. Every episode is dedicated to our Patreon members. I truly could not do this without you.